Welcome back everyone to the final chapter in our deep dive into the most controversial PlayStation 1 games ever made. This is part 4, the last stop on our journey through the strange, the shocking, and the flat-out infamous titles that defined the edgier side of Sony's iconic console. Over the past 3 episodes, we've explored games that push boundaries with their violence, their subject matter, and their sheer audacity. Now we're closing things out with the final batch of PS1 games that dared to challenge the norm, and in some cases, crossed the line that sparked real-world backlash. So without further ado, here's an additional 10 controversial PlayStation games. V-Rally launched on the PlayStation 1 in 1997, and it quickly gained attention for being one of the most ambitious rally racing games of its time. But it also stirred unexpected controversy, particularly in Europe. Developed by Eden Studios and published by Infogrames, V-Rally was heavily marketed as a simulation-style racer boasting official FIA licensing in real-world rally vehicles. However, early adopters were quick to point out that the physics engine fell short of its promise. Critics accused the developers of misleading advertising, arguing that the game's actual driving mechanics felt overly arcade-like and lacked the depth and precision expected from a rally sim. This backlash was especially heated in the UK gaming press, where publications like Edge and official PlayStation Magazine published scathing reviews, claiming the title misrepresented what a true rally experience should feel like. The rift between marketing expectations and in-game reality created a divide between casual players who appreciated the accessible controls and the hardcore sim fans who felt deceived. The controversy didn't stop at the gameplay mechanics. Licensing disputes also erupted around V-Rally's use of real car models and manufacturer branding. While the game was lauded for its inclusion of popular rally cars like the Subaru Impreza and Mitsubishi Lancer Evolution, questions arose about whether all trademarks were properly secured for international distribution. Rumors circulated that certain car manufacturers were dissatisfied with how their vehicles were portrayed, both in terms of performance, balance, and visual accuracy. These rumors gained traction when later regional releases subtly altered vehicle details or removed certain liberties altogether, moves that sparked speculation about behind-the-scenes legal conflicts. Additionally, the game's staggered release dates and inconsistent cover art between regions led to confusion over whether players were receiving the same product globally. All of this combined to give V-Rally a somewhat polarizing legacy, a game beloved for its graphical achievements and fast-paced thrills, yet clouded by issues of authenticity, miscommunication, and a lack of transparency in its promotional strategy. 1. Released in 1997 as a third-person action shooter that drew immediate attention for its intense pacing, cinematic visuals, and unique narrative presentation. But it also sparked controversy for its extreme violence and dark tone, which felt out of place in the broader PlayStation catalog at the time. Developed by Visual Concepts and published by ASC Games, 1 cast players as a man with a cybernetic arm fused with high-powered weapons, fighting through dystopian environments with unrelenting aggression. What unsettled many parents and media watchdogs was how the game glorified destruction. Players were actively rewarded for blowing up vehicles, killing swarms of enemies, and leveling parts of the environment. The over-the-top action combined with the constant on-screen adrenaline meter that encouraged a kill-to-survive mechanic was seen by some as dangerously nihilistic. At a time when games like Crash Bandicoot and Final Fantasy VII were defining PlayStation's identity, 1 felt like a visceral outlier that pushed the boundaries of acceptable content, drawing fire from conservative media circles and some gaming columnists alike. Was accused of glamorizing violence, especially in a period when the video game industry was already under scrutiny from political figures like Senator Joe Lieberman. The game's minimalist storytelling, delivered without dialogue, relying instead on visual cues and haunting cutscenes, was both praised for its artistic risk and criticized for its lack of moral framing. Critics argued that without context, the protagonist's rampage could be misinterpreted as mindless violence rather than a journey of survival or redemption. Furthermore, the game's technical showcase, particularly in its real-time lighting and destructible environments, made the carnage feel more real than what many parents were comfortable with. As a result, one ended up in the crosshairs of debate about the psychological impact of video games, a flashpoint in the ongoing cultural conversation about violence in an interactive media during the late 90s. The Raiden Project. The Raiden Project launched for the PlayStation in 1995, and it was initially praised for its faithful arcade-to-home conversion of Raiden and Raiden 2, two beloved vertical-scrolling shoot-'em-ups. However, controversy soon bubbled up, primarily due to its pricing and perceived lack of added value. Unlike other early PlayStation titles that showcased the system's 3D prowess, the Raiden Project was a 2D game, and critics and consumers alike questioned why a collection of already aging arcade games was being sold at a premium price point. The game was seen by some as a lazy cash-in on nostalgia, especially in North America, where arcade culture was beginning to fade. Reviewers expressed frustration that a game with minimal enhancements and basic menus was being marketed as a flagship shooter for a next-generation console. This sparked wider debates about whether publishers were taking advantage of early adopters by recycling older titles without meaningful updates, undermining the promise of next-gen gameplay that Sony was using to market the PlayStation. Another point of contention came from the cultural sensitivities around the game's imagery and themes. Although the Raiden Project was a straight port of its Japanese arcade counterparts, it retained militaristic visuals, enemy forces that bore resemblances to Cold War-era designs and environments reminiscent of real-world cities, some of which were vaguely evocative of war-torn landscapes. In the context of the mid-1990s, with conflicts in the Gulf and tensions in Eastern Europe still fresh in the public consciousness, some critics viewed the glorification of aerial warfare and uncontextualized destructions as tone-deaf. Furthermore, the game's title, Raiden, a reference to a Japanese thunder god but also the name of a World War II Japanese fighter plane, led to minor criticism from a few Western critics who found the branding insensitive, particularly for older players who associated the name with Japan's wartime history. While the controversy was relatively muted compared to other more explicit games, the Raiden Project became an early example of how the PlayStation's global ambitions sometimes clashed with the regional sensibilities and expectations about content, relevance, value, and cultural awareness. Darkstalkers, the Night Warriors. When Darkstalkers, the Night Warriors arrived on the PlayStation in 1996, it brought with it not only Capcom's signature fast-paced fighting mechanics, but also a wave of controversy surrounding its provocative character designs and supernatural themes. Unlike Street Fighter, Darkstalkers was steeped in gothic horror aesthetics featuring characters like Morrigan, a seductive succubus with overly sexualized animations, and Lord Raptor, a zombie rock star who wields a guitar-shaped chainsaw. These elements caused concern among parent groups and conservative media critics, particularly in North America, who argued that the game's suggestive imagery and occult motifs were inappropriate for the younger audience typically drawn to fighting games. Morrigan, in particular, became a lightning rod in this debate due to her exaggerated figure, revealing outfit, and flirtatious behavior, which many felt was a deliberate attempt to sexualize a game intended for teens. Retailers in certain regions, including parts of the US Bible Belt, even hesitated to stock the game or place it behind counters, fueling discourse about censorship and age appropriateness in video games. Further intensifying the controversy was the game's bold use of demonic and religious symbolism, which drew criticism from religious advocacy groups who claimed it promoted occultism. Characters like Anarchus, an undead Egyptian pharaoh, and Bishaman, a possessed samurai warrior brought to life by dark spirits, were seen as glamorizing necromancy and spiritual possession. While Capcom defended the game as a creative and stylistic homage to classic monster movies and an international folklore, critics were less forgiving, particularly in the US, where debates around the influence of violent and dark media on children were at a peak following the incidents like Mortal Kombat controversy and growing concerns around media violence. The game's localization process even involved toning down some of the darker elements for Western audiences. Yet many of the original artistic choices remained intact, leading to moral debates in gaming magazines, TV shows, and even community forums. Despite the backlash, Darkstalkers carved out a cult following, celebrated for its risk-taking and stylized rebellion against sanitized mainstream fighters, but not without becoming a symbol of the cultural growing pains the video game industry was facing in the mid-90s. Dead or Alive. Dead or Alive released on the PlayStation in 1998, and it quickly ignited controversy, not just for its innovative fighting mechanics, but for its unabashed sexualization of its female characters. Developed by Team Ninja under the direction of Tomonobu Itagaki, the game introduced a physics system that simulated breast movement in an exaggerated, highly stylized way, which was clearly designed to appeal to the male audience. While the core gameplay was praised for its counter-heavy combat and fast-paced action, much of the media attention and consumer discussion revolved around the so-called jiggle physics, which many critics felt undermined the credibility of the game as a serious fighter. Feminist groups and parental watchdogs in both the US and Europe criticized Dead or Alive for objectifying women and reinforcing sexist tropes, pointing out that the female roster was not only scantily clad, but posed in overtly suggestive ways in both gameplay and promotional materials. This stirred a broader cultural debate over the sexual representation of women in video games, particularly as the medium was becoming more mainstream. Adding to the controversy was the way Dead or Alive marketed itself. Advertisements leaned heavy into its provocative visuals, often highlighting the female characters in poses or outfits that were more akin to adult entertainment than sports combat. This marketing strategy led to backlash from parents and educators, some of whom called for the game to be rated more strictly or even pulled from the shelves. In certain territories, retailers refused to display the game prominently or placed it under restricted categories. Meanwhile, gaming publications were divided. Some embraced the game's boldness and technical polish, while others condemned what they saw as a regression in how female characters were portrayed in the medium. Despite the backlash, Dead or Alive's notoriety arguably helped fuel its popularity, with controversy acting as a form of viral marketing. The franchise would go on to lean even more heavily into its risque branding in future entries, but the original PlayStation release marked a turning point in how sexuality and representation were debated in gaming circles, prompting lasting conversations about content ratings, audience, targeting, and the responsibility of game developers. Before we move on with our list, I'd love to know what you think so far. Sound off in the comments below if you're enjoying this video. And while you're down there, be sure to hit the like button. It helps out more than you know. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming videos. Okay, back to the list. Primal Rage. Primal Rage stomped onto the PlayStation in the mid-1990s, and it carried with it a wave of controversy that mirrored and at times exceeded the debates surrounding Mortal Kombat. Originally an arcade game developed by Atari Games, Primal Rage features prehistoric beasts and gods battling for dominance in a post-apocalyptic world. But it wasn't the dinosaur-style combat that drew criticism. It was the graphic violence and one particular finishing move that sparked widespread outrage. One of the game's characters, Chaos, a grotesque ape-like god, had a fatality where he would urinate on a defeated opponent, an action that was intentionally crude and played for shock value. This move, along with other gruesome finishers like heart-ripping and body smashing, ignited criticism from parent advocacy groups, particularly the American Watchdog Association, the National Institute on Media and the Family. Some retail chains went as far as to pull the game from shelves or restrict the sale to minors. The uproar was significant enough that home console versions, including the PlayStation, altered or outright removed some of these controversial elements, although Chaos's original fatality still lived on in gaming legend. The controversy deepened when the PlayStation version was released, as it was expected to be a more polished and acceptable adaptation of the arcade hit. Instead, it was widely criticized for poor controls, long load times, and choppy animation. But what angered parents and educators was the fact that the game's mature themes were not adequately filtered for the home audience. The ESRB rating system was still relatively new at the time, and Primal Rage became a lightning rod in the debate over how video games should be regulated for violent and inappropriate content. Critics argued that the combination of hyperviolence, deity worship, and crude bodily humor pushed the game into territory that was inappropriate for the teenage market it was clearly aimed at. The game's bizarre mythos, which included tribes of worshippers and primitive rituals, also drew fire from religious groups who felt it trivialized spiritual themes in a way that was disrespectful or even blasphemous. Though Primal Rage never achieved the cultural dominance of other fighting games of its era, it quickly remains tied to its controversy, serving as an early example of how edgy design choices could stir public debate and provoke re-examination of video game content standards. Tomb Raider. Tomb Raider debuted on the PlayStation in 1996, and it quickly became a pop culture phenomenon, but not without sparking intense controversy, particularly surrounding its protagonist Lara Croft. Marketed as a strong, intelligent, and athletic adventurer, Lara also became a lightning rod for criticism due to her hypersexualized design, with exaggerated body proportions, tight-fitting clothing, and camera angles that often lingered on her figure. Many critics argued that Lara Croft was less of an empowering female icon and more of a product of male fantasy. This tension intensified as the game's marketing leaned heavily into Lara's sex appeal. Magazine covers, posters, and even commercials often emphasized her appearance over her in-game heroics. Feminist commentators and media watchdogs accused Tomb Raider's publishers, Core Design and Eidos Interactive, of exploiting gender stereotypes and perpetuating unrealistic standards for women in video games. The controversy ignited a larger conversation about the portrayal of women in gaming, a discussion that would follow the franchise for years. Adding further fuel to the fire were rumors and urban legends that swirled around the game shortly after its release. One of the most infamous was the so-called Nude Raider cheat, a hoax that claimed players could unlock a version of Lara Croft without clothing. While no such feature existed in the official game, the rumor was so widespread that it led to fan-made patches and mods for the PC version, which only intensified the public scrutiny. Eidos and Core Entertainment were forced to publicly denounce these modifications and took legal actions against websites hosting the content. Nonetheless, the very existence of such a rumor revealed how deeply Lara's sexual image had permeated the cultural imagination, overshadowing her role as a pioneering action heroine in a male-dominated genre. Meanwhile, religious and cultural groups in certain countries took issue with the game's exploration of tombs and ancient ruins, accusing it of trivializing sacred sites and artifacts. Despite these controversies, Tomb Raider became a symbol of both progress and problematic representation in gaming, embodying the growing pains of an industry struggling to balance commercial appeal with evolving cultural standards. Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear Solid launched for the PlayStation in 1998, and it revolutionized storytelling in video games, blending cinematic direction with stealth gameplay in a way that captivated critics and players alike. However, it also ignited controversy over its mature themes and narrative boldness, pushing boundaries rarely seen in mainstream console games at the time. The game tackled complex political and philosophical issues such as nuclear proliferation, government corruption, genetic engineering, and the ethics of war. Critics and parents groups were especially alarmed by the game's graphic depictions of torture, most notably a segment where the player character, Solid Snake, is physically electrocuted during an interrogation, and the player must mash buttons to endure the pain. While this scene was essential to the plot, it sparked debates over whether such interactivity crossed the line into sadism or desensitization. News outlets and watchdog organizations questioned if the game was appropriate for teenagers, despite its M for Mature ESRB rating, and called for stricter regulations on content involving torture or political messaging with interactive media. The controversy didn't end with violence. Metal Gear Solid also drew heat for its psychological elements and meta-narrative techniques, which some players and critics found disorienting or manipulative. One infamous boss fight against Psycho Mantis broke the fourth wall by reading the player's memory card and forcing them to switch controller ports, an innovative mechanic that also stirred concern over privacy and data access. Others took issue with how the game portrayed mental illness, as characters like Mantis and Sniper Wolf were depicted as psychologically disturbed individuals, shaped by trauma, violence, and war. While fans lauded these characterizations as deep and humanizing, detractors argued that they reinforced harmful stereotypes. Additionally, the game's heavily militarized plot and detailed references to real-world geopolitical conflicts made some government watchdogs uneasy. Despite the criticism, Metal Gear Solid stood its ground as an artistic triumph, but it also left a legacy as a lightning rod for the tensions between narrative innovation and cultural sensitivities in video games. Pandemonium launched for the PlayStation in 1996, and it stood out for its vibrant 2.5D platforming, quirky tone, and colorful visuals. But it also found itself embroiled in subtle controversy that revolved around its characters and marketing. While the game itself was relatively tame compared to other titles of the era, some parents and critics raised concern about its irreverent tone and the portrayal of its protagonists, especially the female jester, Nikki. Her design, featuring exaggerated form-fitting attire, was viewed by some as unnecessarily provocative for a platforming game marketed toward a younger audience. The juxtaposition of cartoonish visuals with subtle adult humor and stylized character designs led to criticism that the game blurred the lines between child-friendly aesthetics and teen-oriented content. This ambiguity was especially problematic in the mid-1990s, when the ESRB rating system was still earning public trust and parents were looking for clear indicators of age-appropriate material. Pandemonium carried an E for Everyone rating in some regions, despite content that some felt skewed more toward older players, prompting concerns about the standard and consistency of the rating system itself. Moreover, the game attracted controversy in certain European regions due to its depiction of chaos magic and occult symbolism, particularly in its narrative premise. The story begins when Nikki and her companion, the mischievous wizard Farkas, accidentally summon a destructive entity while performing a magic spell, an event that sets the entire plot in motion. While clearly intended as a comedic fantasy trope, some religious and conservative groups criticized the game for featuring young protagonists who dabble in magical rituals, to the ongoing cultural debates about the influence of occult imagery in children's media. These critics claim that Pandemonium, like other fantasy titles of the 90s, was part of a trend that normalizes the use of magic and sorcery, potentially desensitizing younger audiences to themes traditionally considered taboo. Although the controversy never reached the fever pitch of titles like Mortal Kombat or Doom, it nonetheless positioned Pandemonium within the broader conversation about the responsibilities of developers when merging whimsical gameplay with themes that tiptoe into darker, more mature territory. LSD Dream Emulator. When Dream Emulator was quietly released in Japan in 1998 for the original PlayStation, it became one of the most enigmatic and controversial titles of its era. Not because of explicit violence or sexual content, but due to its surreal, often disturbing psychological themes and deeply experimental nature. Developed by Osamu Sato and based on a real dream journal kept by a staff member at Asmik Ace Entertainment, the game defied all conventional norms. Players wandered through a dreamlike world filled with bizarre textures, disjointed architecture, and inexplicable events, where logic was abandoned in favor of randomness and subconscious expression. This non-linear, often unsettling structure drew immediate concern from parents and critics who felt the game blurred the lines between entertainment and psychological manipulation, leading to widespread misconceptions that the game promoted or was inspired by psychedelic substances. The game's disturbing visual imagery, disorienting soundtrack, and unpredictable jump cuts added to the perception that it was meant to stimulate a drug-induced experience, creating discomfort in a market that was growing increasingly sensitive to media influence on youth. Beyond its name and aesthetics, LSD Dream Emulator stirred deeper controversy due to its perceived mental health implications. Critics argued that the game's random and often anxiety-inducing design, where peaceful landscapes could instantly shift to nightmarish hellscapes filled with screaming faces or abstract representations of death, could trigger emotional distress or disassociation, especially in players with underlying mental health conditions. Some psychologists and educators in Japan even warned that the game's immersion in dream logic and subconscious symbolism could have negative psychological effects if played extensively. The lack of objectives or traditional gameplay mechanics only fueled these concerns, with some interpreting the game as an experiment in behavioral suggestion or simulation for mental illness. While the game was never officially banned, its distribution was extremely limited, and it developed a cult following mostly through imports and emulation. Today, LSD Dream Emulator is regarded as a piece of avant-garde game art, but its legacy remains intertwined with the unease it provoked. A title that dared to explore the dream world and, in doing so, walked the fine line between creative genius and psychological provocation. And so we reach the end of our deep dive into the most controversial PlayStation 1 games ever released. This part marks the final chapter in our exploration of the bizarre, the provocative, and the downright infamous titles that shaped the darker legacy of Sony's beloved console. From boundary-pushing violence to shockingly bold themes, we've uncovered how these games stirred debate and often ignited real-world outrage. And with this last lineup, we close the curtain on a legacy of games that weren't afraid to provoke, challenge, and sometimes offend. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. What are your thoughts on the games on this video? What are your thoughts on any of the PlayStation games I've covered, or any other videos I have on my channel? Let me know in the comments below. If you liked this video, please leave a like. If you didn't, that other button seems to work pretty well too. And if you're new here, please consider subscribing for a plethora of gaming-related content, including but not limited to controversial games. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.